Episode 2 of Second Nature. Welcome back, everybody. I am Dylan Bowman here with my co-host Aaron Lutzi. Aaron, episode 2, buddy. Good to see you.
I'm so fired up, man. The response from episode 1 was great, overwhelming almost. It was really cool.
Yeah, well, we've been talking about it for such a long time. It's great to get it out in the world. And yeah, I appreciate the early response and everybody who's taken the time to listen and provide feedback. We do not have time to really catch up and chit chat here, Lutzi, because we got a full packed docket here for episode 2. We're going to touch on 4 subjects here. We're going to talk first about the vision for Second Nature. We teased this in episode 1. We'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to achieve here with this new media project. Then we're going to talk about Rich Roll's new podcast network called Voicing Change. Then we're going to go straight to Lutzi's wheelhouse and talk about an athlete strike that just took place down in Rotorua, New Zealand, around the Crankworx mountain biking event. That's going to be Lutzi educating us on that. And then we'll finish, as we always do, with our brand product content segment to send you off into the weekend with some stuff to keep you inspired and motivated in your outdoor adventures. Lutzi, for this first topic, what is Second Nature? I figured it would be good to just do quick 60-second introductions of ourselves personally. So why don't you get us started? Just talk a little bit about what you've been doing, what you've achieved in your career, and sort of what led to this Second Nature project.
All in 60 seconds. All right, where do we start?
Keep it short.
I was at one point a professional athlete, but then began my content creation journey and then found my way to Red Bull, where over 12 years I did everything from event production to every sort of style of marketing you could possibly imagine, and into the athlete marketing territory, which is where you and I met. And as part of that, we did a lot of video production. So the Emmy that's behind me here and all those things kind of came along with that. So I got a chance to do just about every single thing that Red Bull actually does, including a couple days putting cans on shelves. So while I was there, I had such an amazing opportunity to interact with every style of marketing and every kind of person that would come in the door with that. From there, I went on to Aura, where I had a chance to kind of double down on a lot of that stuff. And a lot of the work that I've done since Red Bull has been exactly that, working with athletes, working with content creators, working in so many different ways to just take the essence of what I gathered my career to this point and putting it into practice.
Awesome. That's a good synopsis. Probably right around 60 seconds too. Well done. Way to package it.
Sweet.
Okay, so to our listeners, my name is Dylan Bowman. I'm a longtime professional athlete. Actually, Aaron and I met when he recruited me to be an athlete for Red Bull. I still remain grateful to be a Red Bull athlete here, as I just turned 38 last week. I still, train and race and try and compete as a professional athlete. It's becoming increasingly harder with all the different things that I've got going on. I'm also a dad, as is Lutzi. I'm a father of 1. He's a father of 3. But he and I have been great friends. And I guess in the last 3 years or so, my focus has really turned towards my other media business called Free Trail, which is basically sort of consumer facing media platform, audio, video, newsletter, written publishing. We own 2 race events. We have fantasy trail running. We have an end of year sort of MVP award. And that has turned into an overwhelming and all consuming career for me as I sort of slowly transition away from my competitive athletic career. But I'm also a avid listener of podcasts and a lifelong lover of the audio format. And so I guess, transitioning from the personal introductions to what is Second Nature, Lutzi, is it okay if I just kind of launch into a quick soliloquy and then you can fill in some holes?
By all means.
Okay, great. So yeah, as I was saying, I listen to a million podcasts, and I have been drawn, especially as I've been trying to create and build my own business, to podcasts in that territory, podcasts that talk about business and entrepreneurship, things about the media business, things about the business of sports, things about health and wellness, and just sort of try to educate myself about what it means to create anything in the world. And as I've learned in the last 3 years of trying to build my own business, it's truly the hardest thing in the world. And I just love that podcasting creates a free way to convey education to people. And I've been so lucky to absorb so much wisdom through the podcast medium. And I've always felt like, man, there should be something that talks about and gives people education and resources of how to make a career in the outdoor industry, which you and I have been very lucky to do. It's a it's a segment of the economy that is growing, that remains like incredibly important, and where people are incredibly passionate. And so it felt to me that there was an opportunity to help people who are working in the industry to understand what's going on, and people who are peripheral to the industry but interested in business or interested in outdoor sports and who are active and passionate about these activities, to help them contextualize and understand some of the things that are happening in the industry concurrently. Maybe I'll pause there. Aaron, anything you want to add about that original vision?
I think one of the things that's also really interesting that I heard recently was like, if you want to get truly good at something, try teaching it. And so I think a big part of where this came from is the conversations you and I have had where we try to share information and teach each other something. But as we're going through the process of coming up with the right things to share in our weekly podcast, we're learning stuff too, and we're teaching each other. And so as much as this is about sharing that knowledge with other people, we're also sort of reaping the benefits. So selfishly, I'm really glad that we get a chance to do this because no doubt we're going to learn things along the way. We're going to uncover things that we probably wouldn't have before. And then we can also share that out with a lot of other people. So there's so many different things that are coming together here, and all of it is great.
Yeah. So our hope, I guess, is that we want to be sort of indispensable for people who are trying to build brands, businesses, and careers in the outdoor industry. But we also want to provide something that's entertaining to listen to if you work adjacent to the outdoor industry, or if you're just interested, like I was saying, in these activities, if you feel passionate about recreation and all the benefits that it brings into your life. We hope that this is a platform that will provide some value to you as well. So maybe going into what this might look like practically for our listeners here, Lucy, I'll just launch into it and then you can fill in some holes again. I view this as a sort of a three-phase project, and I have to give you credit here at the front because my instinct is always to have the long wind up and the big splashy launch. And it was you who persuaded me to say, no, let's just like get this thing started and just see what happens. It doesn't need to be a big deal out of the gates. And now it's a more low pressure, passion project, which is exactly what it should be for the both of us. We were both heavily consumed with our main things at the moment. And so gets to be something that we do recreationally and for fun, although we do have ambitions to make it a little bit more professional in the future. But starting with this phase one idea, obviously, we're starting with a podcast and newsletter, which we're hoping to be able to deploy every single week to talk about what's happening in the industry, providing our context and analysis to help people think about it. We also think in phase one, we're going to be doing something that's, I think, interesting, different, and very exciting. And that is that Aaron and I are also working to create and launch our own consumer product and our own brand. So not only are we going to be talking about what's happening in the space, but we're going to be doing it. And we are going to be sharing the story top to bottom, front to back, from the beginning to the end. And we're being intentionally cryptic here. And I'll pass it to you here in just a second, Aaron. But this is something that we've been incredibly excited about. We have a very interesting idea for a consumer product. Aaron is in a unique position to help bring this thing to life, or we make a good team to help bring this thing to life. And we want to share the journey of trying to create something in the world. So not only are we just talking about it, but we're doing it. Aaron, anything you want to add to that for phase one?
I think phase one, the idea of just starting it now and just getting the ball rolling, lines up with this Mike Tyson quote: everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And for us, I think we just need to start, and we are going to learn. We're going to iterate. We're going to make things as best as we possibly can. That's sort of our MO of like, okay, I see this thing that I want to do. I'm going to put it out into the world. I'm going to take the feedback. I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can. I'm going to continue to make it better and better and better. Like where you started with Free Trail and where I started with Super Rider and all the other projects that we've had our hands on over the years, where they are now is not the same as where they started. And that's okay. it's okay to iterate. It's okay to incorporate feedback and build things. And so I think it was really important for us just to start this process, to start going in this direction with it, and then we can tack according to the wind on the way. And that's really what it all comes down to.
Heck yeah. So that's phase one, podcast newsletter. And very soon we're going to be updating you about our own little consumer product that we hope to be launching into the world sometime here in 2024. Maybe I'll button phase two and phase three together real quick and you can respond, and then we'll move on to the topics on today's docket here. Phase two, as I see it, Lucy, is potentially adding products and services to help people who are trying to make careers in the industry. And this, I think, could take any number of different forms. I think between you and I, we have a lot of experience of being athletes, working with brands. So I think there's potentially a lot of opportunity for us to help brands think about their athlete strategy, help brands think about their content strategy. Obviously, those two things overlap in a lot of cases, and operating in that intersection is a place where I think we can be of service to people in the industry and brands in the industry. I also think we can be of service to other athletes, and we can talk about potentially what form that might take, but maybe providing education or representation or management to professional athletes who are working in the space, or, potentially providing a community sort of opportunity for people to share their learnings, and a platform through which we can help professional athletes build successful careers in their given sports. So that's something that you and I are, I think, both passionate about and excited about. And then phase three is something that I think, is sort of a pie in the sky idea for the both of us now. But the thing that I have just found in the last 3 years is that building businesses is so fun and also so freaking hard. And I just would love to help other people build businesses in the sport. And that could be in a number of different ways, whether it's consulting or advising people, or potentially like raising some money and investing in people who are trying to build businesses in the industry, whether it's, consumer products, technology, services, things like that. So that's sort of how I'm viewing it. Phase one, very easy podcast newsletter, try and build a little brand ourselves. Phase two, phase three, potentially offering products and services to brands and individuals in the space. What did I miss there, Aaron?
I think what it all comes down to is that you're setting intention. You want to be helpful to the most amount of people in the part of the world that you care about the most, which is the outdoor industry. And you and I collectively have done almost every single job that you could do, from being an athlete to being the content person to building the brand to building the business to figuring out all the in between stuff that's not, fit for a podcast. One of the things that I think really kind of hit the light bulb for us was that first podcast that you and I did, where we talked about athlete sponsorship and all that. And we got such an insane amount of inbound from that, of people from both the athlete side and the brand side, just really excited about the conversation that we we're having, but also wanting to talk to us about it, and us realizing like, oh, there's a lot of interest to have this discussion to help a lot of other people out. And I think as we go from phase one, phase two, potentially phase three, like there's a lot of different ways that we can be useful to a lot of different people. And, regardless of anything in phase two, phase three, at least listening to the conversations we're having, at least checking out the examples that we're sharing, or the topics we're discussing, is going to be helpful to a large amount of people. And if we can work one-on-one with people down the line, that would be even better.
So, a media platform, potentially with a future agency attached to it, potentially far off in the future with maybe an investment arm, an operational arm attached to it. Who knows? Second Nature episode 2. We're just getting started. We'll see where this thing goes. Anything else you want to add before we move on to Rich Roll?
I think that's a great starting point for it. And we sort of showed what we meant in the first episode, and now we're breaking it all down, and now we can dive into exactly what we're here to do.
Hell yeah. All right. So Rich Roll made some news last week. Of course, Rich Roll, for those who don't know, is an iconic podcaster and author, a very interesting human being who's got a profoundly inspiring story. We'll probably dig into that a little bit, but he's also a pioneer in the podcasting space. And he's one of the OGs and one of the best podcasters, a fantastic conversationalist. And he announced last week that he was going to be starting a new podcast network that he's calling Voicing Change. In that podcast network, there's going to be a number of different shows hosted by a number of different high profile people. It's quite a talented cast. So maybe Lutzi, starting with you, I know Rich Roll has been a show that you've listened to. You and I have both riffed a bunch together in private conversations about just, the impact that he's had. We've both read all of his books too. So maybe just provide a quick intro to this. And then I was thinking that I would just sort of read parts of the press release and then we can riff on it.
Sure. Oh, and I was vegan for like 6 years too, so that's Rich Roll's fault too. Uh, I mean, the podcast network is really interesting, and I would be really curious at some point in this discussion to kind of see how this lines up with some of the stuff you're doing with Free Trail, because you also have multiple shows, right? You've got the Mid Packer Pod, you've got Trail Society, you got to hit on a lot of different areas of trail running and sort of the culture around it. And I think what you see with what Rich is launching is that it's very adjacent, right? You see a lot of similar topics, kind of like if you exploded out a Rich Roll podcast, or if you took 100 of the people that were on the podcast and you categorized it in these different categories, the people that he's bringing in to be hosts and to have shows within his network are very similar and adjacent to the topics that he talks about. So it looks like two of the shows are completely net new with Rainn Wilson and Alexi Pappas. Then there's a handful of existing podcast hosts. So the Conversation has got a pretty strong history. I mean, Lady Gaga's been on it. There's a ton of others. Zoe Saldana. There's a bunch of people that have been on that already. Then Feel Better, Live More. That has 1 million people following it on YouTube. The Proof with Simon Hill is a pretty established podcast. It's really more about like diet, exercise, all these different things. And of course, you've got Rich Roll, who's extremely established. So it's a mix of a little bit of everything. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just curious from your perspective as someone that kind of also runs a podcast network. What's your initial take on this?
So I think it's smart and interesting, and I think intuitive evolution of the platform that Rich Roll has created for himself. I think before I go into some of my perspectives for the audience, I'm just going to read the first half of the press release and then we can riff off it together, because I think it'll sort of set things up a little bit better. So what it said in the press release, I'm just going to read the first half first, because then the second half, I really want to get your perspective on how the structure of this might look internally. But the first half basically says, Rich Roll, the visionary behind the phenomenally successful independent Rich Roll podcast, is launching a groundbreaking new podcast creator network, Voicing Change Media. The network launching today will share powerful stories across a spectrum of voices, sparking conversations that inspire, educate, entertain, and empower people to live healthier and more authentic, purpose-driven lives. Voicing Change Media will feature a diverse lineup of new and established shows, including Soul Boom by Rainn Wilson, Feel Better, Live More by Dr. Chatterjee, The Proof by Simon Hill, Mentor Buffet by Alexi Pappas, and The Conversation by Amanda de Cadenet. The additional programming currently in development. So they're dropping seeds already that this is just the start. They're going to continue building. And then it goes on to say, the venture is in partnership between Rich Roll Enterprises and talent management firm RXR Sports, boasting a client roster that features acclaimed athletes like Alex Honnold, Jimmy Chin, Emily Harrington, and Scott Jurek. Quite a lineup. So going into what you just asked me, yeah, I think this is an interesting, aggregation of talent, of people who clearly have resonated with particular communities and who have subject matter expertise. I think it is interesting that it is a mix between shows that are currently in existence and new products like Soul Boom with Rainn Wilson and with the Mentor Buffet with Alexi Pappas. Maybe we can come around and talk about how those might look. But to me, it feels like this is effectively, an extension of the Rich Roll brand. As you said, it does almost feel like the shows and the subjects that are included here in Voicing Change is an explosion of the Rich Roll podcast. And we should say that, he's sort of like, I don't know, a thought leading pioneer and an example of the possibility of self-transformation, even in middle age. Famously, he was a lawyer and then found sobriety and endurance sport in his 40s, and then was, like I said, an early pioneer in the podcasting space. And the thing that I found really interesting about this is that if you look at the existing shows, at least, you could make the argument that they are sort of competitive with Rich Roll's main podcast. And so I found it to be just I don't know, an interesting phenomenon to think about in terms of, that competitive landscape in podcasting and the, I don't know, the spirit of abundance maybe that's present in Rich Roll's attitude here, to rather than try and push away shows that could be seen as competitive, to bring everybody together and find ways to, you know, have a rising tide lift all boats. So anything you want to add there? Because I think that's something that would be fun to continue riffing on, but also, I think there's yeah, just like the competitive part of it. Like, do you feel like these shows have lookalike audiences? In other words, we should probably get around to talking about the purpose of bringing everybody together.
Yeah, I think that probably does make sense for him to bring in the most adjacent topics and audiences, because someone who listens to Rich Roll would probably want to listen to these other things. So it makes sense, right? Like, if he's going to push a podcast, I don't expect Rich Roll to push me like, I don't know, like a money podcast or like a whatever podcast. Like, I would rather that he pushed me something that was interesting on my health or my mindfulness or whatever. I think my biggest question when it comes down to existing podcasts is, what was the pitch to them? And there's a lot of different ways. Like, are you getting access to a wider network of guests that could be on? Are you getting access to a wider network of advertisers that could be on? Or is this straight up like production help? Because you and I both know how much effort it is to make content week in and week out. And so if you look at this, you're like, okay, well, there's a bunch of different shows. Each one is going to have an audio component, a video component, a short form content component. Is voicing change really sort of like on the back end a production house that's like, hey, all you got to do is sit here, film this, we'll take care of the rest, we're going to cut down your shorts for you, we're going to worry about uploading stuff, we're going to take the production stuff off your side? So there's a lot of different pieces that exist in this program that voicing change could be taking off the plate of these people.
Mm.
And I think that's really like what I'm most interested in. Are we going to see them do these other things? So there's a company called Assembly, which is like Sahil Bloom and these other guys coming together, and they work with other creators, and each one is kind of targeted, right? Like, one company only does short form content, one company only does long form content, but then anybody who needs that help kind of comes in and gets that one service. And it's been really interesting to watch them go out and do all these different, I think they're doing 12 companies in a year that they're launching. Each one's like very specific. And I'm just curious to see if actually voicing change is a production house, if it's an advertising network, or is it something bigger? I don't know. Or all the above could be too.
Yeah. Okay. So then, just coming back to like the purpose of this network, which you just sort of led to, like, from my perspective, it's mostly an advertising play, I would guess, right? Like, obviously they're providing a service to a lot of the shows in the network, but especially with the established ones, yeah, you'd have to come to the table with some sort of a value add in order to justify bringing them in. And I'm sure there's some sort of financial element that would, some sort of a revenue share with the advertising revenue that's coming in. And I don't know, as I think about it, if you aggregate the listeners of these particular shows and their demo, it makes me feel like it's probably a very valuable audience that they have. And so the purpose of it is to bring and aggregate all these listeners together so that they can package something with a centralized sales force and take it to brands in sort of the health and wellness space and say, hey, you're looking to reach this demographic. It's probably mostly people from 25 to 55 who are health oriented, probably have disposable income, generally what you would describe as a very valuable audience. And so
Mm.
bringing everybody together, centralizing that sales force takes the work off the creator's plate and probably creates more leverage for voicing change to demand higher ad CPM rates from advertisers. Comments on that? I mean, so to me, it seems like sort of the best of both worlds. Like voicing change takes some of that sales, production, marketing work off the creator's plate, while also making it easier to then do the sales process to the brands.
I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but do you sort of mean like buy low, sell high? Because think about it this way, like he's aggregating all these things, and some of them are successful channels, some of them not crushing it, but still like solid. And imagine he'll definitely have every single one of these hosts on his podcast to make sure that he's driving viewership to all the other podcasts. It's going to be his focus, surely, for the year to build up all these podcasts to be huge. And if that happens, which he can put his thumb on the scale, if that happens, then you're right. He can go with like this network to every single partner out there and be like, well, you could get access to all these shows and they're all huge because, again, like he put his thumb on the scale for the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk about the second half of this press release because I think this is very much in your wheelhouse. But maybe quickly, I'll just share a little bit about my experience with the whole podcast network phenomenon. With Free Trail, we have a few shows underneath our umbrella, but we operate in a way that I think is, obviously like we're a medium-sized fish in a much smaller pond, where Rich Roll is very much the big fish in a big industry, right? Like the health and wellness space is a large part of sort of like the economy, and therefore there's, I think, obviously a financial element to these relationships, and we could speculate as to what that might look like here in the second half of this conversation. But for Free Trail, right, it's more of a brand play than it is like an economic play. So we don't monetize any of the other shows in our network. We just sort of operate with the subjective feeling that, hey, if they put out good content that has an impact, that does good in our subculture of trail and ultra running, that in some way, even if it's hard to measure, it will have a positive impact on Free Trail, the brand. So it's more, like I said, a brand play than an economic play for Free Trail. For voicing change, and maybe I'll read this second half of the press release before I tee you up. Obviously, there's going to be a financial element to this, and that's probably the whole purpose, is finding incentive alignment with all these different creators and having that rising tide lift all boats. So the second half of the press release reads, in launching Voicing Change Media, we're aiming to fill a void in the podcasting landscape, says Roll. We are building a community of purpose-driven creators, thinkers, visionaries, artists, science educators, and storytellers, and amplifying their voices. By partnering with RXR Sports, Roll and his business partner, Greg Anzalone, aim to leverage their collective expertise to help creators better monetize their shows and achieve a broader impact with their content. We are thrilled to broaden our partnership with Rich Roll Enterprises to support visionary creators and offer them the resources they need to grow their podcasts, said Jonathan Retzek, founder and managing partner of RXR Sports. We believe deeply in the power of this model for creators who will continue to own their shows while leveraging the strength of their community to reach new audiences and value aligned brand partners. Voicing Change Media is a testament to the idea that profound personal and social change begins with dialogue. Every conversation, every word, and every shared story holds the potential to ignite minds and create a better world. So that's the totality of the press release here. I think the RXR Sports involvement here is an interesting one, and one that I think you could help contextualize for the audience.
Yeah, I actually sat next to Jonathan Retzek at Kate Courtney's wedding last year, so I know I've worked with him quite a bit within Red Bull, and the roster that they put together at RXR. I think you mentioned a few of them earlier, but they've got a really, really awesome roster. Even if they were just to cycle their athletes through a lot of these podcasts, that would be a huge win for a lot of people. I think it's really interesting going back to what you were saying about Free Trail, where it's like some of these are brand and some of these are we were talking about brand and product last week, but like how some of them are do one thing and some of them do other things. It's really interesting to think about this in that context. Like, are they thinking about every single one of these podcasts the same way? Are some of them higher value than others? Are some of them more brand value than others to the overall network, I think is really interesting. But RXR, the thing that's also kind of stands out to me is how more established creators make a habit of helping out the creators that are coming up. It's not really a zero sum game at all. And in fact, in my own world, in mountain biking, Seth, who runs Burn Peak, which is arguably one of the biggest mountain bike channels in YouTube, was one of the first people to get on the phone with me and talk to me for like 2 hours and help me kind of get set up and help me get a leg up to the point where, now I'm in a pretty good position. And it's cool to see Rich Roll using what he has and leveraging, the relationships that he has and RXR has to bring other creators and put them in a position where they can have sort of life-changing results. To see this happen kind of in real time is pretty cool. And the reason why you and I are here are sort of the same way. We want to take what we've learned and share it with lots of other people, and hopefully people benefit from this. They get to do jobs in the outdoor industry. They get excited to go launch something. They go do incredible things. This is even more intentional in that of like, I want to take these 5 or 6 people and really boost them up and give them the opportunity to max out the podcast to see what's actually possible to push this podcast and that podcast to a level that maybe they couldn't have achieved on their own. I think RXR is a really important part of that because their network from who they work with, just with even athlete sponsorships, they've got a huge Rolodex of people that they're working with. You look at the people that Jimmy Chin has worked with over the years, or I mean, anybody on that roster. RXR's got direct lines into some of the biggest names in the industry, and probably the ancillary relationships that come from that. I mean, they could pretty much get in touch with anybody. So I think that's a huge, huge piece to the puzzle beyond just the high quality of the podcast and the guests and everything else that they're going to have. They've kind of got the best of all worlds when it
Yeah.
comes to this scenario. You've got a giant podcast network. You've got one of the best partnership agencies in the business, and now all you have to do is worry about making good content. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all you got to do.
So it's probably just a joint venture between two businesses, Rich Roll Enterprises and RXR. Rich Roll is represented by RXR. If we haven't stated that explicitly, that my guess is they probably handle the ad sales for his show. And so they will effectively be taking on, my guess is, the ad sales role and the marketing role for this new Voicing Change media platform, and leave the creators to then focus on the important work of actually doing the creation. So
So it's all the infrastructure. So ad sales, production work, like just make it easy for the creators. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better scenario if you're one of those podcast
yeah,
hosts.
just an all-star group coming together here. It's going to be really interesting to follow along. One thing that I looked into, and we can start winding down this conversation and get to Crankworx, but a person who I would love to learn more about is this Greg Anzalone guy. Maybe it's Anzalone, Greg Anzalone, who's the CEO of Rich Roll Enterprises. Rich has talked about him in a couple of places because I listen to a lot of not only Rich Roll's show, but when Rich Roll is on other people's shows, I listen to those, and I've heard him mention this business partnership and how important it's been to him and how successful that he's been in growing this amazing business that he's created for himself that has touched the lives of millions of people around the world. But Greg seems like an interesting guy, and you can't find a lot of information about him on the internet. The only person that I can find that may be the guy is somebody who worked in sort of the collectible space in Hollywood, who would take things from Batman and Star Wars and create products that you would sell to fans of those hit movies. So anyway, an interesting business partnership, and somebody who behind the scenes, I'm sure, has a big hand in this new Voicing Change platform.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to have a sparring partner or somebody that you can talk about business with all day, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
One of the things about this network that's really interesting, and you mentioned that he kind of dropped a few seeds of like some stuff that may be coming soon. But one thing that I would love to see that I think would fit into the adjacency of the topics that Rich talks about, there needs to be some sort of female Andrew Huberman. There needs to be Gabrielle Lyon, Rhonda Patrick, somebody like that who can deliver for that audience. The stuff that you hear on Huberman or Peter Attia or any of those guys, a lot of that information is specific to men. And the physiology, there needs to be a woman who can do the female version of that, for so many reasons. And this is such a huge opportunity for Rich and the Voicing Change team to go put that person on. I know that Gabrielle Line and Rhonda Patrick have been on podcasts and they've been involved with certain stuff, but if you're going to loop somebody in, it's such a huge opportunity. You look at how big some of these other guys are, they're massive, and people will literally do everything that they say. There needs to be a woman in this scenario too, and what a huge opportunity for Rich to take advantage of that, really.
Yeah, I wonder if that's in the roadmap. One thing that's just popping into my head that maybe we can close on, bringing it back to kind of more of the outdoor action endurance sports market, is what would it look like in that space, right? If you package shows like my with the Free Trail podcast and Pace and Show, the Adventure Stash, maybe the Bomb Hole in snowboarding, pick a couple others from skiing, from surfing. Like, what if you package that together in a podcast network and do the same thing where, hey, the audiences of these shows, they have some things in common. There's probably not a lot of overlap in people who listen to my show versus people who listen to the Bomb Hole, for example, but they're clearly outdoorsy people who have an appreciation for pushing their limits, of doing things out in Mother Nature. What would that maybe look like to bring a bunch of creators together in the outdoor space and then have that positive sum situation where you can take some of the workload off the creators and also have better leverage with advertising partners? Anything you want to add there before we move on?
It's really interesting because if you look at it from the outside in, there are a lot of those brands that work with athletes of all those things. So, like, think about it. North Face, for example, has running, but they also have snowboarding, they have skiing, they have all these different, people that they want to reach. And so you could think about how it might look to have like one deal, but the ads being very targeted. And you have this ability to be hyper targeted and find these brands that are trying to message a wide variety, but for them they have to go out and do 5 different deals. You're simplifying the process for them and making it a lot more efficient if you could offer up that network. And I think that's really what Rich is doing here too, of like, if you want to speak to this person, we have them in our network and we can get to them this way and this way. And you don't have to go after 5, 10 podcasts and do like a giant media spend. We can be way more targeted with where it goes, and you could do the exact same thing. And then it also opens you up to put together shows like this, where it's like, this isn't specifically about mountain biking or trail running or anything. This is the in between stuff that like everybody's kind of interested in and wants to know the details on. And I think when you have that network where you're talking about all these other things, that makes room for the kind of in between. And that's, to me, where the most exciting stuff is.
So cool. Well, shout out to Rich. Good luck to everybody in this Voicing Change media group. You can find more information at voicingchange.media. We'll make sure to put a link in the show notes if you're interested to look and read more about it. Lutzi, let's talk about Crankworx. This is something that you sent me earlier in the week. Big news in your realm. So why don't you give us the quick 2 minutes on what is Crankworx, what happened down in New Zealand last week, and then we can go from there.
There's a lot to cover here, so I'm going to try to go really fast. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of detail that's not out there. There's a lot of opinions, but let me tell you the basics. So there's a worldwide series called Crankworx, which is a mountain bike festival series kind of event where they have 4 or 5 different disciplines that people compete in around the world. In Whistler, Rotorua, New Zealand, there's one in Europe, there's one in Australia. And slopestyle is the main event of the whole thing, where mountain bikers go downhill and they do tricks on their way down from top to bottom. And it is by far the biggest spectator draw in the event. They also have downhill racing. They have an event called Speed and Style. It's kind of wonky. They have a pump track thing. They do a bunch of other things, but everybody's pretty much there for slopestyle. If you see or even Google Crankworx Whistler slopestyle, it's basically like the Super Bowl of mountain biking. Everybody is there. It's like tens of thousands of people packed on the mountainside. And Crankworx has been doing slopestyle events for 20 years. So they are definitely old hands. They've established it. Their events have created heroes in the sport. They've done a lot of really incredible stuff. But the idea of traveling around the world and competing in all these things, it's expensive, it's difficult, it's risky, and the level of competition is so ridiculously high right now that you have to be dedicated to it. What happened this past week in Rotorua, the riders at the riders meeting basically set forth a list of, let's call it demands, of requirements, right? We are not going to ride in the event unless you can satisfy these requirements. One had something to do with practice time. One was they wanted the event to be hosted earlier so that the whole thing could be on the live stream and not usually like as far as mountain bike events go, later in the day, the wind picks up and then the event has to be canceled. So what had been happening a lot throughout the years is that you'd maybe get one run in and then they'd cancel the event and give whoever had the best first run the title when you didn't get your proper time. So just, can we have it start earlier so that we get a full fair shake to do this thing? And the last request that they asked for was an appearance fee to show up to the event. Now, to put this in context, Crankworx is getting a $8 million grant from the country of New Zealand to host this event there. Crankworx is also selling sponsorship against this event. Crankworx is also selling tickets to get into the event. There's a lot of stuff that's being brought in. And these riders are asking for, there's, I believe, 16 riders. They're asking for a $2,000 appearance fee. So, like, it costs at least that to get to New Zealand, but okay. For each event we go to, can you fund our travel to get there and take care of us while they're there? One of the minor gripes that came out was like the entire production staff had like a buffet lunch and we got literally nothing. The thing is, slopestyle is the main event. That's the reason why everybody's there, and they're not doing, in the riders' opinion, enough to take care of the riders, but they are flying in and accommodating and paying all these other people, like the judges of the event, the hosts of the event, the production team that puts on the event, the builders. Like 16 people in the grand scheme of things is sort of a drop in the bucket for this. Now, we also know that event production is hard. Margins are razor thin. There's a lot of other things that go into it, and we don't know all the details of everything. But in the end, the riders boycotted the event and didn't ride in the event, and there were a lot of opinions based on that. The last thing that I'm going to say before I pass it back to you is that, this group of riders is sort of the second generation of riders. So they didn't come up in the era where they had to establish the sport. So when we were riding in the original, we were just trying to get this thing to make sense, to get people to invest in it, to believe in it, to come see it. This is like the next generation that's building on top of that. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, a group of, mid 20s dudes, like, they're not going to execute everything perfect.
Right.
So that's that.
So who is Emil Johansson? Because I looked into this guy and it feels like he's like the LeBron James of the sport. And
Yeah,
having
he's
his weight
won.
behind it probably adds a little bit of extra emphasis or a little bit,
Absolutely.
yeah. Ta-
He's the best rider. He is number one. I don't think he's lost a Crankworx event in like 7 or 8 events. I think, I forget what the
I've got
number
his
is now, but he's
Instagram
based.
profile up here. It says he's a 4-time slopestyle world champion, 13 times Crankworx gold medalist. He's only 24 years
Yeah,
old.
he's the GOAT. I mean, this kid just every single time wins. One of the things too is that, sure, for someone like Emil, he is winning all the time. He's collecting the prize money. But what's interesting is that a lot of the riders have been pooling money together from their winnings to be able to fly in the guys who are like 8 through 12 on the invite
Mm.
list. So they're actually helping each other get to the event. That's the level that we're talking at. These guys aren't like on a cash grab to get like show up money just cuz. Like, they are actually like putting a lot of money on the line. To travel with a World Series like this would cost anyone from like 20 or 30K per year. I mean, imagine, like, could you just go to New Zealand right now? um, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to compete. They're trying to travel. They're trying to take care of themselves on this trip. There is prize money, but you have to make it through the event without crashing to get that prize money. And these guys are just looking for some sort of guarantee to make sure that they're not going to, you know, come out behind. Meanwhile, there's like an event, which is a business. In fact, that business was just recently sold a year or two
Mm.
ago, so it must be somewhat profitable.
Okay, so I think it's probably pretty clear for our listening audience the perspective of the athletes, right? Maybe you and I can talk about the perspective of Crankworx, the event management business. As you said, hard business, especially when you're traveling internationally and trying to execute at a world class level. A former Crankworx executive named Mark Taylor posted a reaction to this, what he described himself as a rant on his LinkedIn, where he effectively made the argument that this was sort of a stunt by the athletes. What would you say to that? What would be your response to Mark's critique of the athletes here?
I would say that, like I said earlier, a bunch of 20 somethings, they're not going to execute everything
Yeah.
perfectly. But this is not the first time in the sport of mountain biking or any action sport that this has happened. And you may be surprised to learn that almost every other event outside of mountain biking and a few mountain bike events like Red Bull Rampage actually do pay an appearance fee for riders that are coming and putting on the show. Without slopestyle, Crankworx has got a pretty hard path to profitability, and I don't think they'll get the same crowd coming through without that event. So the riders do sort of have them in a spot where if they continue to boycott, which they've got to figure this out
Yeah.
basically. But I think, yeah, I don't expect them to do everything perfectly. But when you have these conversations, they did have leverage last week, and Crankworx kind of balked at it. But yeah, is that the question? If they would have come in February or at the end of last season and been like, listen, like we're not showing up until this gets figured out, would it have been a different outcome? I don't know. They definitely have to take them seriously now. Would they have blown them off in December of last year?
So I'm just pulling up the Crankworx website here because I think so. There's 4 total events in a season: Rotorua, Cairns, Innsbruck, and Whistler. And I think you're saying that Whistler is sort of the Super Bowl, probably the championship style end of season event. So,
Yeah,
but what
that's the
this means
one.
is that the pro male athletes effectively nuked 25% of the season. Is that right? Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, and that's got to be a hard decision. I mean, to get everybody on the same page to do that kind of thing is that's tough.
Yeah.
But you know, for them, they got together. And ultimately, the other thing to think about is that this season is the first season that women are riding the Crankworx slope style as well. And they will, Crankworx match the prize money for the women to the men. And so if Crankworx agrees to an appearance fee for the men, it will also probably apply to the
Mhm.
women, which would be huge because of course there's discussion of, oh, these guys are sponsored and they should use their sponsors travel fee. All of this is also taking into consideration that the mountain bike industry is in shambles right now from a sponsorship
Mm.
standpoint, from a business
That's what
standpoint,
we should
due
do
to
an
the
episode around eventually.
yeah, the long-lasting effects of the pandemic and increased inventory and all that stuff have really put a lot of the partners and sponsors in a tough spot, which has then trickled down to the athletes. So there's a lot of stuff at play. It's not as simple as just like this event producer and these 16 athletes. There's a lot of like things are just getting difficult out there, and these guys are trying to survive. But the point I was just to wrap up the point I was making is that whatever happens with the men will then also trickle down to the women, which would be an extremely positive thing because the level of support that some of those riders have isn't probably in most cases even close to what a rider like Emil
Mhm.
has. So for them to also get an appearance fee, for them to get supported so that they can travel to events will be a net positive thing for mountain biking, slopestyle, and
Yeah.
Crankworx ultimately.
But, again, to give Mark Taylor the benefit of the doubt here, to see things from Crankworks perspective, that money has to come from somewhere, right? And now these athletes have deleted 25% of the season. I'm sure the sponsors of Crankworks, the event series, are not too happy about this. And I'm sure there's some meetings that are being held about what the implications are around this. But if I were a sponsor who was ponying up a lot of money to make this event a reality, and then we had something like this evolve, obviously there would then be a breach of trust between the events and the pro athletes, which creates a really hard environment to align incentives and have a positive working relationship. But something happened in trail running recently that I sort of view as analogous, and that was UTMB, which is effectively the Crankworks of of trail running, the sort of the biggest global event business. announced a partnership with Dacia, which, from my understanding, is effectively sort of the European equivalent of Subaru. And there was kind of an uproar in the trail running community and a bit of a protest around it, around UTMB Mont Blanc, which is effectively the Crankworx Whistler for our race. Again, using this analogy, sort of the Super Bowl of trail running. And obviously the protest was around, hey, why would you partner with an internal combustion engine vehicle when we make our living, or when we pursue this passion in the outdoor environment that is, exists in opposition to, the dangers and harms of internal combustion engines and fossil fuels. And you can see that as a cogent argument, right? But then also you see it from the business perspective of, hey, we are a growing grassroots sport in the process of going from hyper niche, totally obscure, into the realm of real commercialization. And that's created a lot of tension in the space, right? And then for UTMB, it's sort of like, wow, we've engaged a non-endemic partner to be the title sponsor of our event for the first time ever, when we've seen things like this happen, obviously, in every other sport where non-endemic sponsors see the value in these audiences and therefore want to make an investment in it. And the first non-endemic sponsor to come into our sport gets met with like total hostility and protest, right? And so I don't know, it's difficult in when our passions are in existence with business opportunities, right? And I don't know, I just felt like that was sort of analogous here, where Crankworx, I'm sure they're trying to do their best to operate a profitable enterprise. You mentioned that they received millions in funding from the New Zealand government to make this race a success. We haven't seen their financials, but you would guess that that money can and should trickle down to the athletes to some degree. But their argument is, to what extent should we capture the value here for our own event? How much should trickle down to the athletes? And how much is it our responsibility to make sure the athletes are making a living when they have their own partnerships on the side there too? Anyway, a difficult situation, no clean answers, but definitely an interesting thing here to monitor for the rest of the Crankworx season.
The one thing I would end it on is that I don't think there's anybody that wants to see sports survive and thrive more than event producer. The amount of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into putting on events is insane. It is so, so hard. And it's easy to be on the sidelines, taking shots at Crankworx or UTMB or anybody else. But like, these people want to see these sports survive and do incredible things, and they are doing everything they possibly can to make the sport grow. And we may not always agree with it, we may not always love the tactics or approach, but like, these people want it just as bad, if not more, than we do. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we see this stuff go down, because it's hard. Putting on an event is hard, and I have all the respect in the world for all the Crankworx people, all the UTMB. Like, I know that this stuff is challenging. I've done hundreds of events, and every single time it's just it's so much work for like no thanks. When things go right, no one cares. When things go wrong, everybody cares. And that is a razor thin
Yeah.
line.
Well, I'm sure both sides of this argument think that they're operating in the right way, and you'd assume that reasonable people are involved and that conversations are happening and that they'll find some middle ground that will ensure that the rest of the Crankworx season goes off without a hitch. Because otherwise, I mean, if this turns into something where multiple events are compromised, that probably puts the whole business in jeopardy, which puts the careers of all the athletes in jeopardy at the same time. So they each have an incentive to come to some amicable conclusion here.
Absolutely.
Okay, moving on, Lucy, to our closing segment, brand product content. If you didn't tune in last week, this is just our closing feature where Aaron and I will just discuss something that we noticed in the industry this week that inspired us or caught our attention. Lucy, you get us started.
Oh, I get to go first. All right. All right. So I've got kind of a weird one, but I hope you'll stay with me on this. So this past week was also the Barkley Marathons, right? Shout out to Jasmine Paris, first women to finish the Barkley Marathons, along with I mean, what an incredible year. Amazing all the way around.
Yeah.
But I think that Barkley Marathons is the anti brand. And I love that. The idea of the anti brand is the antidote to stuck culture. If you're not familiar with stuck culture, I'm actually going to put an article in this week's newsletter. But stuck culture is the best example I can give you. In 1984, you could have gone to the movie theater to see Dune and Ghostbusters. In 2021, you could have gone to the movie theater to see Dune and Ghostbusters. And in 2024, you can go to the movie theater and see Dune and Ghostbusters. That's the definition of stuck culture.
Ah,
The amount of sequels, the amount of copy paste that's going on in our world. And the antidote to stuck culture, in my mind, is the anti brand. So Barkley Marathons is so opposite of what you should do. Think about Lachlan Morton and the alt tour, the guy who rode the Tour de France, but like on his own. Think about Patagonia. They're like encouraging you not to buy their stuff. Like all these anti brands that are out there, I think is sort of the way forward and how to think about how you could create an anti brand to do something that's different instead of just like copy paste. That's my BPC for this week.
I love it, man. What a perfect contribution there. And maybe something that I can tie in with my answer here for my contribution here this week. I had a different idea of what I was going to share this week, but I listened to a podcast on the plane on the way home from Montana yesterday. Do you ever listen to Invest Like the Best with Patrick O'Shaughnessy?
No, tell me
Yeah,
about
it's
this.
a great business show, sort of general interest, but a lot of it touches on, the super esoteric stuff in the finance world, which I don't have a deep understanding or appreciation of, but he's a fantastic interviewer and I just love listening to him for that reason. And this week's episode was with a guy named Sean Feeney, who for a long time was your traditional finance guy. I think he was some boring bond trader on Wall Street and made a career pivot and got into the restaurant business in New York City. He became friends with somebody who is now a very famous chef. I think her name is Missy Robbins. And the two of them made a great partnership where he's sort of the business operations finance guy and she's the talent who knows how to create beautiful and delicious uh, plates and meals for their guests. And as somebody who worked in the world of hospitality and food and beverage myself, I just have always been drawn to people who work in the restaurant business. I just think it's such a labor of love and such a hard thing to be successful at that I just find the stories of people who are successful in that industry to be incredibly inspiring. And in this episode, they talk about a couple of things that I think are relevant to our show here. One is like, what point does it make sense to make a huge career pivot? I think this is something that you and I both very much resonate with, that I think we'll be talking about here on the podcast here in a little while. But going from, a traditional bond trading role on Wall Street to being the owner and operator of many of the New York City's best restaurants is kind of a crazy transition to make in your 30s and 40s, but also it makes perfect sense, right? And if you develop an auxiliary skill and then bring a fresh mindset to a new industry, what does that look like, right? And in what way does it potentially provide an advantage over the incumbents in that industry? The other thing, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because they talk a lot about like finding your zone of genius, right? And I wanted to bring it back to Rich Roll, right? Because he made this huge career pivot in his 40s, right? He gets sober, he starts getting into endurance sport, and now look at him. He's got his own creator network, his own podcast network, in addition to having one of the most successful podcasts in the game. And I just think that this is something for us all to think about, is like how to align with our zone of genius with our careers. And I have two examples of friends of mine who very much provide an example of this, right? One guy who has worked at the Nature Conservancy in development for the last 13 years. And if he showed up at a trailhead and got out of his van, you'd look at him and be like, that guy works in development at the Nature Conservancy. He's been hyper successful in raising millions of dollars to protect land for future generations, and he exudes it. And in conversation with him, you'd be like, if I had money to contribute to this cause, I would give it to this guy. He works in his zone of genius. I have another friend who works in real estate in Aspen, Colorado, and he's a charming dude from South Carolina, has sort of a subtle Southern accent. He got into real estate probably in his mid 30s, got his real estate license, and almost instantaneously became the most successful real estate agent in Aspen, Colorado, which is obviously a very expensive market. But if you talk to
Yeah.
this guy, you'd be like, I would buy a house from this dude. And it's just like one of those things where, like, when you find your spot, right, everything just sort of clicks into place and you can truly shine as a human being. And that's what this podcast brought into my consciousness as I was listening to it on the way home. Again, Invest Like the Best. The guest was Sean Feeney. They're talking mostly about the restaurant world, but it's very intuitive how it could be applicable to anybody's life as we start to think about our careers and aligning with our zone of genius.
I feel like I'm somewhere near your zone of genius right now. I can feel it emanating.
anyway, that was a great episode. Episode 2 in the bank, Lucy. Look at us, 1 hour deep. Any closing comments for our listeners here before we get going?
I would say I hope that you are enjoying the newsletter that we're putting out. This will be week 2 for that. And if you haven't checked it out, secondnature.media is where you can find us. It's a little bit of show notes. It's a little bit of expanded topics, and we're continuing to grow that week over week too. So go check it out if you haven't already.
Go subscribe to the newsletter. Make sure you're subscribed on all major podcast players. I'll make sure to put a link to our YouTube channel in the show notes as well. We're going to be putting material up there too that'll be native to that platform eventually. And we're just getting started here. We appreciate everybody for tuning in. We'll see you back here again next week.